So our final presentation of this session is going to be by Timothy Ringgold, who's the Director of Sonic Divinity Music Therapy Services in Orange, California. And Tim's also a certified music therapist and works with Frank Meiskens, who's here, my colleague, who's the Director of the UC Irvine Cancer Center. And Tim is going to focus on the use of music interventions in the ambulatory cancer setting, a place we particularly like to use it, which is the chemotherapy suite. Where we find it really drops tensions. I think one of the things that Barry and Holly really emphasize that's critical is that music in those settings, environmental music or even interactive music with a music therapist, isn't only great for the patient, but the family members who are accompanying them and all of the staff too. Ready to go, Tim? Thank you.
Dr. Willman. Thank you. Raise your hand. How many people in the room have been personally touched by cancer, whether it's yourself, family member, friend, colleague? And then just take a second and look around the room. Right, so we're talking about a concept, but we're also talking about something very personal. For me, I was 25 when my dad died of cancer, and I'm the youngest child in my family. I'm the baby. That's me in the middle. I'm always protected. So when it came time for my dad to go through chemotherapy and radiation, my big brother at the end was the guy that got the job to take my dad to chemo. And I never got to see what happened. I just saw him come back sicker and sicker, till eventually he let me know he was going to go on hospice because they had told him there was nothing more they could do for him. And when my dad died, the artist Enya was playing on a tape recorder in his room when he died. Anybody know the artist, the vocalist Enya? Yeah, it was like having the sound of an angel in the room with my dad as he passed. And I was a 25-year-old young guitarist in a heavy metal rock and roll band at the time. And I had this thought in that moment, and my thought was, man, if I could be the soundtrack of someone's transformation from life to afterlife, that would be the highest use of my God-given gifts. And 15 years later, as a board-certified music therapist, I get the privilege of working with cancer patients in the cancer setting, and I walk alongside with them, with patient after patient, as they fight for their life. And we may not know each other, right? We just meet, but we have a very close mutual friend, music. And I get the chance to bring their dear friend, music, to them in perhaps the most physically and emotionally intense chapter of their life. Imagine you're trying to cram your life into a treatment that you don't know whether or not will work. How many friends and family do you tell? Do you tell your boss? Are you afraid of being fired? Which of the landmine of side effects might you step on? You face a treatment that, depending on the cancer and depending on the patient, has a varying level of success, a varying level of side effects, to such a degree that one really doesn't know what it's going to be like to go through chemotherapy until they go through it. Now, how many people in the room love change? And the older you get, the more and more you're comfortable with it. Yeah, me neither. So the average age of patients I treat is 55, and as adults, patients have come to get used to how things work, a sense of control, planning, self-actualization. And being a patient in the infusion center throws a pretty big cog into that wheel. Now, I am speaking to and among the very best of the best in the fields of music, the brain, and music therapy. But today, I'm not going to talk to you as your suffix. I'm going to relate to you like I do all of my patients, someone I've just met who I have a very close mutual friend with, and that mutual friend's name is music. So I provide music therapy at the Chow Family Comprehensive Cancer Center at UC Irvine Medical Center in Orange, California, principally to treat pain, anxiety, and nausea symptoms. We are still in our infancy of developing a comprehensive, fully funded music therapy program. So early on, I realized that my interaction with patients is going to be tiny compared with the 70 or so patients that come through the infusion center every day. So, and even the patients I do see, the average number of times I see a patient is just over once. So that gives you a sense of just how small our program is. So I had this thought. I was thinking, what can I do to empower each patient to use their old friend music in a new context? See, most of us are used to being with music and using music in an entertainment or an educational context. And while we've been prescribing ourselves music for mood regulation our whole life, it's been pretty recently that the medical community has really been able to see the physiological effects of our old pal music on the brain and body. So, armed with some research that what's being done in this setting, I created this teaching tool that I call Music Medicine. It's just a simple, easy-to-read flyer. It's colorful. Patients come in for their first chemotherapy treatment, or when I meet them for the first and probably only time, I give them this flyer, and I do a brief teaching session on the therapeutic and physiological effects music has on the brain, so they see it in a new light and see it as a complement, as Barry suggested, as to their primary treatment, truly music as therapy. Here's the main points that the tool teaches them. Patient-preferred music is the most effective music to use as a therapeutic tool. Music making promotes improved immune system functioning by lowering cortisol levels, increasing SIGA production, and NK cancer-killing cell production. Our bodies can and do physiologically sync and train to music. Music listening can lower stress prior to a medical procedure. And music therapy can be an effective adjunct for pain management in cancer patients. And you can dial in your preferred music for free using software like Pandora.com and iTunes Radio. Anybody here heard of Pandora.com before? Yeah, fascinating project. You go online, Pandora.com, you type in an artist you like, it feeds you a song by them, and then it looks at the musical elements of the song and starts to build a playlist based on those elements, which you have already said you like because you've selected that artist, and starts to feed you more and more music that you might know of or not know of, but based on those elements, prefer. And it's free. iTunes Radio, anybody in here use iTunes Radio? Are you familiar with it? When you go to iTunes, a lot of people are familiar with the store, but there's a radio. So if you go, there's like this little button that says radio. Click on it, and you can click on any genre of music you like and open it up and search for radio stations, internet radio stations that pipe in music of that genre for free 24/7. So that's a great tool for anybody who's looking to access preferred music. Now, I teach them they can build these relaxing playlists before and during infusion. And you want to know one of my favorite sites in the infusion center? This is great. I'm walking down the hall. I turn in one of the treatment bays, and I see one of the patients that I had worked with and given this flyer to at a previous session. And I see him earbuds in, hat on, blanket up, eyes closed, smile present. Out. Love that site. That is good medicine for me. I don't know about you, but long car rides, sleep through it, goes by quick. Sit in the infusion center for 6 hours, hey, hang out with your old pal music and fall asleep to it. Have that day go by quicker for you. So again, the idea behind this is simple. Patients battle symptoms of cancer and cancer itself 24/7, but they're only in the infusion center as often as they are, and they're only exposed to a music therapist even less. So let's empower the patient to prescribe recorded music therapy or recorded music as therapy to themselves for physiological as opposed to psychological purposes. Now, there's another level of using music as therapy that we and countless other hospitals and infusion centers employ, which has been discussed richly this weekend already, which is live music performed by volunteer musicians. Countless organizations like the Pittsburgh Symphony we heard of yesterday, Longwood Symphony Orchestra's LSO on Call in Boston, which I'm sure we'll hear about tomorrow, right, Amy? And then Musicians on Call in New York, Music to Heal in Orange County, Music in Hospitals in the UK, Resounding Joy in San Diego, all recruit, train, and deploy their members as volunteer musicians to provide live music in a medical setting. Live music in a medical setting goes back as long as we can remember, and we've heard the American music therapy movement traces its roots back to volunteer music in the medical setting. I'm often asked why recorded music isn't just piped in, why the live music? Well, I've observed there's definitely, we've talked about this social element of music this weekend, and there's definitely a psychosocial aspect to live performance that's important to address. In 2008, I was in a series of meetings with the medical director of the NICU at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego to discuss bringing NICU music therapy into their hospital. And my colleague, Kat Fulton, and I were explaining to Dr. Gail Knight that there's research done by Dr. Jane Stanley at Florida State University that shows that the presence of live music in the NICU results in an overall decrease in decibel levels of ambient noise in that setting. Now, ambient noise is a huge concern in the NICU and has real implications for care. Dr. Knight shared that they tried using recorded music in the NICU, but all the nurses fought over who was going to be the DJ. That was it, really. That was what was going on. But when they brought in a guest harpist from the community, nobody argued over the music selections. And my personal take, I believe this is because people are so genuinely and pleasantly surprised to receive high-quality live music in this setting, in this context, that they set aside their personal preferences. And they genuinely adopt, as cliche as it sounds, an attitude of gratitude for having live music at all. So rather than resist the cultural current we swim in, it is very pragmatic to employ the use of highly skilled, well-meaning musicians for creating a peaceful ambiance in waiting rooms, foyers, and other public treatment spaces within a medical setting, or organizing musical activities, lessons, and playrooms in pediatric setting to encourage patients, get out of their rooms, socialize, normalize, express non-verbally the emotions they're feeling, as well as be diverted from the symptoms they're experiencing. Now, there are important factors related to music selection, timbre and tempo, and volume that need to be understood by everybody if they're going to bring, by volunteers, if they're going to bring music into patient areas. But look, with proper training, these factors can and are properly addressed. This is one of those jokes every music therapist has seen before, but I thought I'd share it with the world. Music therapy, or music, is a very powerful tool. It needs to be administered responsibly in a fragile medical environment where improper use can result and can cause negative physiological effects, which I will talk about in a minute. So what about music therapy? Having said all that, there are things that only a music therapist has been trained in when it comes to working one-to-one with a patient. I can stand here and say that because I was a volunteer musician myself long before I was a music therapist, and there were several key clinical principles I only learned once I went back to school to get my degree in music therapy and do my internship, pass my boards. First and foremost, this difference I learned when I was a volunteer, the music was very music-centered. I was focused on performing music I knew and wanted to share. The patient was focused on listening to me and my music. But as a music therapist, the experience is patient-centered. I am focusing on the needs of the patient, and I'm simply using music as a modality to address the needs, the clinical needs of the patient. And sometimes, no music is what's clinically needed by a patient. Another thing I learned as a music therapist is if I don't musically validate where a patient is first, they will resist moving away from me at baseline. Imagine you are, pardon my French, imagine you are angry, and I come in and I go to play you something really warm and fuzzy. Are you going to, intuitively, what's your gut reaction? Are you going to just jump on board with me, or do you want to kind of give me a knuckle sandwich? You know, when you're angry about something, you need to get that anger out first before you can just change gears. So this, what's called in our field the ISO principle, I have to meet the patient where they are, not where I want them to go, in order to gain their trust and permission to guide them. Another thing I was not trained in as a musician to do was to be able to alter the music I'm providing in the moment to meet the changing biopsychosocial needs of my patient. I love a music therapy pioneer, Joanne Lowy's quote from a talk she gave at the New York Academy of Sciences in 2011, where Dr. Patel and Dr. Tomaino also spoke. She says, quote, "I can go from heard it through the grapevine to Frere Jacques quicker than an iPod," end quote. In addition, what if a song I start to play triggers an unanticipated, powerful emotional response in the patient? What if that song was played at their sister's funeral who also died from cancer? Well, my skills as a therapist enable me to process that experience with the patient and not leave them in the negative impact of that moment. Again, do no harm. Who attended the wonderful lecture and concert Friday? Show of hands. Okay. Unfortunately, I was in the fourth row when Prisca Benoit so angelically played Debussy's Clair de Lune. I say unfortunately only because the last time I heard that piece performed live was at my own daughter's funeral, at my request. We did a slideshow on a big screen just like this of her life, and my friend who's a concert pianist played Clair de Lune angelically just like that. It took about 2 seconds from when the music started on Friday for me to be back at my daughter's funeral. Except I wasn't in shock like I was the first time I was at my daughter's funeral. And I didn't want to be disrespectful or distract anyone by getting up in the piece, so I just kind of, hunkered down, but I can just tell you the immense pain, the sorrow, the physical shortness of breath, what gripped my throat, what gripped my chest, the pounding in my head that erupted. I left as soon as the piece ended, and I tried to come back to the room a few minutes later, but as soon as I got to the door and I heard the piano, those physiological effects re-emerged in my chest, in my throat, and in my head. I couldn't go back in the room. But don't worry, I went out into the courtyard and I ate free ice cream. Brought to you by Dairy Queen. I heard that guy say that. Compliments of the Dairy Queen. 25 times. So I was very grateful for Dairy Queen. All right, so lastly, I learned that this is really cool. I learned there's no right type of music or wrong type of music to elicit relaxation. Each person's musical palette, we've talked about this, is like their flavor palette. It's highly subjective. Dr. Zatori's 4 excerpt yesterday morning was case in point. Anyone notice who pumped his fist at the techno? No. Me. I was the guy over there going, yes. I listened to house music and techno music this whole week while I was preparing this talk. All week with Pandora.com, Paul Oakenfold radio station. And the reason why is I have 2 small kids at home and I had to do it late at night and I needed something that had a pulse and a rhythm to keep me awake and keep me going. Conversely, mentor and colleague Lilith Grand shares a story on her blog about a patient whose preferred musical style was gangster rap. A well-intentioned friend had encouraged the patient's mom to play him recorded classical music, to which the patient, in a coma recovering from a TBI, displayed increased agitation and required increased amounts of sedation and analgesics when the music was played. When the sister of the patient informed Ms. Grand of his preferred musical style, she asked her to bring in some of the music. And the moment the preferred music came on the boombox, the patient went, displayed relaxed affect, and the patient required far less medication to keep him comfortable. That's real. The moral of the story is gangster rap can be good for you if you like gangster rap. But this speaks to the potential negative physiological effect and real economic and patient outcome cost of administering the wrong type of music in a medical setting by a well-meaning person. So there have been many physiological reasons about how music works as a therapeutic tool, which have been talked about. I want to add a couple of observations to the mix as to why music works that I've noticed while being on the front line as a clinician. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm a clinician, and pretty sure I'm not the first clinician to notice these things. And I'm a neophyte clinician compared to many of my colleagues here today, but I'm the one up here, so there you go. First of all, music is the only protocol you play. Now, oncology is highly protocol-oriented, okay? As adults, we organize our activity around the concept of work. We go to work, and then we go to the gym, and we work out. And on the weekends, what do we do around the house, in the yard, and on that old car? We work. We work on it. As children, we organize our activity around play. So we play sports, we play games, we go on play dates. When was the last time any of you went on a play date? Right? Now, you might do the same thing. You might socialize. But as an adult, we call it something else. I spent time with Bob. Right? We use different language. Well, folks, we don't work music. We play music. And play brings levity. Play brings joy, release, self-expression. Are these good things to have present in a clinical setting like an infusion center? You bet. We also all have a prior personal and mostly positive relationship with music if you didn't have a really scary music teacher as a kid. Said another way, music, we trust music. It's safe. And it's through this trust that a patient-therapist relationship can be built in virtually no time. Let me give you an example. Here's why. If I walked up to you on the street and we'd never met, and I just start interviewing you about what you do for a living, what you're really interested in, that might be a little weird. Because there's this social barrier about just don't walk up and talk to strangers and interview them. But imagine we're at a cocktail party, and Dr. Willman introduces us. Now, we may still be strangers, right? But we know, like, and trust Dr. Willman. And so we extend that courtesy to each other. And so it is with music. Music is the mutual friend in the room. It's also the only protocol that treats the staff while it treats the patient. It's like a 2-for-1 deal. And we all know that caring for the caregiver is always good medicine. And as the great music therapy author, clinician, and researcher David Aldrich says, music therapy treats the self inside the patient. Now think about that for a moment. It's the self that's having the experience of being a patient. It's the self that has the memory of being a patient. And it's the self that fills out the patient satisfaction surveys and interviews. And patient satisfaction is a new revenue in healthcare, like it or not. So I've coined a phrase to describe, or 2 phrases to try to describe and help paint a picture of the 2 types of music therapy I end up providing in our cancer center: transactional music therapy and relational music therapy. Because the average number of patients, or number of times I see a patient is once, most of my interactions with patients is limited to 1 session. It's almost like a transaction. However, within that 1 session, I'm still able to do an assessment, determine goals and objectives, formulate a treatment plan, implement and observe, and then discharge or terminate that therapeutic relationship. In addition to treating whatever the symptom is that's most acute in the moment, I make sure to teach the patient how to use music as therapy afterwards, after I've already used music in therapy. It's almost like lecture and lab for the patient. So how do I use music in therapy? Well, building upon that triangle of trust, I turn the wheel over to the patient. And Holly talked about this, and Barry talked about this so well. I give the patient control over the interaction, which is the opposite of their role as a patient. See, as a cancer patient, their job is to take direction. Come here at this time, to this building, to this room, sit here, wait for our call. Now come stand here, give me your right arm. Give me your left arm. Give me your right arm again. And then go sit here for 6 hours while I pump poison into you, and then go home and come back tomorrow. As a music therapy patient, they get to give direction. I tell them, in music therapy, you get to drive the bus. You get to say if you have it, and if so, for how long. You get to choose what we do from a menu of options. And then I break the session into 4 evidence-based interventions that they choose from, based on their energy level and their music preferences. And Holly talked about these, and Barry talked about these, so just going to kind of go over them kind of quickly. How does music in therapy work? The most effective intervention in the literature is active or interactive music making. This is when the patient takes an active role. However, many patients unfortunately see themselves as non-musicians. And while I explain that all my instruments are non-musician proof, some patients find the thought of making music akin to public speaking, i.e. anxiety producing. And since we as clinicians are there to do no harm, active music making can be contraindicated in a patient who is genuinely afraid to play an instrument. However, if they have the energy and feel safe and confident and adventurous enough, they'll actively participate, hum, tap, clap, sing, maybe play an instrument. Lately, one of my favorite instruments, and I might get some arrows thrown at me after Holly's demonstration, but we were just talking about the iPad. And the iPad has really revolutionized my practice. Because I bring a virtual harp in with the patient. Now the patient is lying down, they don't have a lot of mobility, and with a swipe of a finger, we hear nothing. Let's cue that one again, and with a swipe of a finger, I begin to hear the harp. Here it is. Now one of the things about iPad apps is they have very high quality sound, and they're very attractive to the eye. So it doesn't look like a toy, and it doesn't sound like a toy. And as we were referring to GarageBand, it has tons of virtual instruments. I am holding probably 20 virtual instruments in my hand. That's very practical and pragmatic for a music therapist, and it takes some of the performance anxiety away from the patient. Because look, it's just an iPad, and iPads are cool, and people like to touch them and play them and make them do things. And if you say it's an app, they're like, wow, that's neat. I'll try it. And it might be just the thing that gets them over the hump of that performance anxiety. And so while they're exploring with this, I may just arpeggiate a gentle 1-4-5 progression on my classical guitar. Same key, so it all sounds together. And suddenly the patient's not only playing the harp, they're improvising or jamming on the harp with a real musician. All with the swipe and swirl of a single finger. That's cool. Step 2, or one step down in energy and a big step off the stage and back into the audience for the patient, is a place where I call Songs from Memory Lane. Here, again, this was so well done. We've talked about this, talking about songs. I suggest songs from their coming of age years. And if I don't have it and I can't play it, I'll pull up our old friend YouTube and we'll pull up their favorite artist together and we'll sit and we'll watch a live performance of their artist. Maybe they haven't seen them perform live in who knows how many years. And then we'll reminisce about where they used to see that person play live and who were they with when they'd go to see that person play live. And it'll bring back those memories from when they were that young, active, anything is possible, I'm invincible kind of time in their life. And those kind of emotions are very useful in this context. However, sometimes patients aren't up to talking about their old friend music and they are not ready to have someone singing at them at 9 a.m. in the morning. So I offer live instrumental music on either my classical guitar, the ukulele, or the Native American flute. And I chose these 3 instruments to specialize in this setting or use very specifically. And I appreciate your question about why these instruments and why the classical guitar. So there's a difference between a classical guitar and a steel string guitar. Classical guitar has nylon strings, different sound. I use the classical guitar. One reason is because a lot of people have not heard it live. It's kind of an uncommon live instrument compared to a steel string guitar. So they're kind of genuinely intrigued just to listen to it, and they appreciate being exposed to it. Plus, it's dynamically very limited as an instrument, which means when you fingerpick a classical guitar, it is really hard to have it be anything other than quiet. And then most directed to what your comment was, the tone and the timbre of the nylon string. It's very soft. The attack of the string is very round. It's very easy on the ear. It's not as percussive as a steel string is, particularly in a clinical setting that's like everything can be washed down and it's all hard surfaces. So it's acoustically very bright. So I'm very concerned about the acoustic nature of the instruments and how percussive they are, because these are patients who are in a reduced, fragile medical state. Now, the uke and the Native American flute, hey, if you live in Southern California, you either go to the desert or you go to the ocean for your recreation. And these 2 very cinematic instruments immediately teleport my patients out of that infusion center. I tell them, I'm smuggling you out, but just your imagination. And I let them choose, where do they need to go? However, sometimes anxiety or nausea may be such that they need to actively distract themselves with more than just the sound of my instrument, and we've been talking about this a little bit. Music imagery has been shown to effectively treat anxiety and nausea, particularly in cancer, thanks to some great work by Maria Montserrat Gimeno. And so I use a very similar thing. I call it the relaxation vacation, and they just like the name of it. And I say, pick a vacation you went on, you loved, and I take them through all the sensory information that they recorded at that scene. So I get them to think about what they saw, what they heard, what they smelled, what they tasted, what they touched. And then when all of that sensory information is now present, how did that make them feel? Because as we know, when we have a memory, those same neural clusters are firing at the recall that fired when they processed it. So the brain's having a very similar experience. So it's very powerful for the patient. And really, I'm just playing, again, a very harmonic progression behind it, very slow based on their respiratory rhythm. And the point is that the music can be used for seemingly opposite reasons, but both of which can provide comfort and relief. So what kind of response does transactional music therapy produce? Well, I recorded pain, anxiety, and nausea before and after the session using a verbal 10-point Likert scale with 54 randomly selected patients. Patient report is the only tool we use for pain in the healthcare system. It's still the gold standard. And there were 40 females, 14 males. Of those 54, 15 reported pain above 0, 24 above anxiety, 8 nausea above 0. And they reported that after 30 minutes of music therapy, their anxiety or their pain symptoms were reduced by 57%, on average anxiety by 63%, nausea by 65%. Now, this is only compared to their pre-session report. It is not compared against control group. The reports are given to me. There's inherent bias. It doesn't account for any simultaneous pharmacological therapies being applied to the patient, so it's only a start. It is a very tough environment to try to control for all those things, as we've heard over and over again. But it's a start, and it's still clinical data. The studies need to be done further to eliminate bias, control for medications, determine which of the interventions cause the greatest change in self-report, and also determine the duration of the effect after the experience as well. And if any of that excites any of you, please see me after. So lastly, once in a while, I get a chance to work with the same patient over multiple trips to the Infusion Center. This is what I call relational music therapy. And here's a few stories from the front that I'll close with to give you a sense of what I mean. There's a unique dynamic to improvisation with a music therapist. When I'm jamming with a friend outside of my practice, there's two musicians wanting equal time to lead. But when I'm there as a music therapist, there's no me needing time to lead, there's just the patient. So I just lay down a rock solid rhythm, and I give them, basically, by giving them strong rhythm, it gives them a foundation and a trampoline for them to express themselves non-verbally as long as they need to. This is Jay, who soloed on his guitar for 8 minutes during our first session. He said to me afterwards, "I've never been able to play for that long, that well." And I replied, "It's probably because no one's ever given you the chance." Jay, another patient, loved my flute so much he went out and bought the very same one in the same key and started bringing it to weekly infusion centers. And I began to teach him how to play, and week after week he could play it a little bit longer. And he had reported his cancer had weakened his lungs to the point he could no longer sing along with the radio, which was a favorite pastime of his. So within 6 sessions of music therapy, only 5 up to 15 minutes total by the 6th session, he came in and told me he could sing along with the radio again. Now that's a pretty great side effect. Jay got his voice back in the midst of getting chemotherapy. That's cool. And then Elle was very anxious upon entering the infusion center, and her anxiety triggered anxiety in her caregiver as well, which that exacerbated Elle's anxiety and so on. Elle loved the relaxation vacation, and in her first session, it took her about 15 minutes before she drifted off to sleep. By her second session, it took 5. By the 3rd session, she fell asleep while I was strapping on my guitar. She had cued her own relaxed response. And that's what's possible in relational music therapy. Now, I got to tell you, Holly's flute playing was gorgeous, was it not? And I was going to sit here and go off and play flute for you for another 5 minutes or so, while flashes of testimonials went on and on. But we don't need to do that because we've just been through there. I'm just going to close so we can stay on time. I'm going to close with 2 important things. One is acknowledgments. I'm going to want to start by thanking Dr. Willman. Dr. Willman, for inviting me, you've given me an unprecedented opportunity to join my people in this community that I didn't even know I was part of. And I feel at home, and I feel fired up as a music therapist again and very hopeful. Number 2, I want to thank Dr. Frank Maskins from UC Irvine, who is here in attendance today, for not only being my champion, but for introducing me to Dr. Willman. I want to thank social worker Jennifer Higgins at UCI for being the first music therapy champion and introducing me to Dr. Maskins. You can see how this is working. Music therapist Helen Dolis for approaching UCI way back in 2007 to begin a clinical placement for students and then selecting me as the inaugural student. I haven't left. And for introducing me to Jennifer Higgins. Lastly, I want to thank the UCI or UC Irvine staff for referring me, and for my patients for the opportunity to know and experience myself as someone who heals with music, because without my patients, I wouldn't get that opportunity. My wish list is, can music be shown to improve outcomes? There was a question about that earlier, not just quality of life in cancer patients. If so, what types of cancer? This is an immensely complicated question. Is someone studying the length or duration of the effect after the music has stopped? Is it relegated to attention? I know that music therapy can be a great adjunct to pharmacology, but what might be the economic impact to healthcare and insurance provider of using the 2 in tandem? There's a good study by Beck, 1991, in oncology nursing that describes a statistically significant decrease in cancer pain when music is used in concert with analgesics. And we need more studies like this, because warm stories are nice, but they don't change the bottom line for administrators who have to make tough decisions about what care strategies to employ, what to exclude. Another example, how much does stress, or it may be expressed by the secretion of cortisol, reduce chemotherapy effectiveness? And if we can lower cortisol production through music therapy, will this improve outcomes? I'd love to work with a clinical trialist to validate these things in music therapy and in the palliative care setting. It's good to do clinical work, but if we can combine it with research, we can double its effect in the world. Volunteer coordinators at health centers and volunteer musician organizations, please have a music therapist employed and leading your teams so that we can firmly stand in the credo of do no harm. And while we can measure many aspects of music in the brain, music is still an aesthetic. And it's still subjective. And how do we validate within the scientific model the qualitative and phenomenological nature of music as well? I can't say to an administrator, you should invest in music therapy modality as a modality because it lifts the spirit. But it does. And everybody in this room has experienced that before. But how do we translate that experience into good science? That's what I got. Thank you.